In the spring of 2020, as the world locked down, one highly specific item quietly vanished from grocery store shelves: baker's yeast. But at the exact same time the industrial supply chain faltered, social media feeds flooded with jars of bubbling, living dough. Millions of people were suddenly baking from scratch, completely without commercial yeast. This highlighted a bizarre blind spot in our modern food system. For the vast majority of human history, those neat little foil packets of dormant yeast simply did not exist. Before the late 19th century, the only way to bake a loaf of bread was to physically capture invisible, wild microorganisms floating in the air and resting on grains of wheat. The pandemic baking craze was an accidental return to form. We were forced to resurrect a 5,000-year-old biological technology that had kept human civilizations alive for millennia. Cultivating this wild culture begins with just two physical ingredients. You mix unbleached wheat flour with water, and you leave the jar in a warm place. The moment water touches the flour, naturally occurring enzymes called amylases activate. They start slicing up the flour's complex starches, breaking them down into simple sugars like glucose and maltose. This exact chemical reaction is older than recorded history. It maps directly to the dawn of agriculture and the Fertile Crescent and ancient Egypt several thousand years ago. In fact, archaeological excavations in Switzerland have uncovered loaves baked with this exact wild fermentation method, dating all the way back to 3700 BCE. Mixing a starter today is an exercise in time travel. You are perfectly replicating the chemical process that fed human empires right up until the Middle Ages. Leave that flour and water alone for a few days, and the dormant slurry comes alive. It rapidly expands, filling with large, bursting gas bubbles. This is the first half of a microscopic ecosystem at work: wild yeasts. These single-celled fungi feast on the simple sugars we just created, burping out carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. The flour's proteins form a stretchy, web-like structure called gluten. This web traps the escaping carbon dioxide, inflating the dough like a biological balloon and providing the physical lift needed to make the bread rise. But the yeasts aren't working alone. The second half of this ecosystem relies on lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria move in to ferment the complex starches that the wild yeast cannot digest. As the bacteria feed, they excrete lactic and acetic acids. This biological exhaust creates the sharp, highly distinct sour flavor of sourdough. By aggressively lowering the pH of the dough, these acids create a harsh environment that kills off pathogenic spoilage microbes and mold. That bubbling jar on your counter is a highly evolved, self-defending microscopic farm. The yeast makes the bread rise, and the bacteria protect the yeast. To keep this farm alive, the microbes require rigorous maintenance, a process bakers call refreshment. You have to discard a portion of the old acidic culture and feed the remainder a precise ratio of fresh flour and water. By tweaking the temperature of the room or the amount of water in the feed, a baker can shift the microbial balance. A wet, warm starter favors lactic acid for a milder taste, while a cool, dry starter pushes bacteria to produce more acetic acid, creating a sharper bite. Maintaining this fragile environmental balance has historically been a matter of survival. During the Klondike gold rush of the late 1890s, prospectors faced hostile, freezing conditions where conventional baking supplies were entirely useless. To guarantee a daily food source, miners carried pouches of living starter pressed tightly against their chests or worn on belts around their waists. They used their own body heat to keep the microbes from freezing to death in the sub-zero Yukon winters. These cultures demanded so much devotion and were so vital to staying alive on the frontier that veteran miners earned the nickname sourdoughs. It was a badge of honor for keeping a demanding organism alive in the ice. When it is finally time to bake, a small portion of this active culture, the mother dough, is mixed into a much larger bowl of fresh flour and water, creating the final loaf. Because wild yeast operates much slower than commercial varieties, the dough requires a long resting period called proofing. Bakers often chill the dough in a refrigerator, sometimes for days, which deeply develops the flavor and strengthens the gluten structure. The baker slashes the top of the dough to control the pressure and slides it into a scorching oven. The trapped carbon dioxide rapidly expands in the heat, forcing the bread to bloom upward in a dramatic final burst known as oven spring. This multi-day fermentation physically transforms the bread. As the wild yeast and bacteria spend hours pre-digesting complex carbohydrates, the final loaf reaches a significantly lower glycemic index than a standard one. The acidic environment also forces the grain's enzymes to break down chemical compounds called phytates, liberating dietary minerals so they can be absorbed by the human body rather than passing right through it. This slow fermentation alters the nutritional architecture of the grain. It extracts more usable energy and nutrients from the same volume of wheat compared to modern quick-rising breads. This deliberate, slow-moving biology was the absolute standard for centuries. That changed in the late 19th century, when, following Louis Pasteur's confirmation of germ theory, scientists learned to isolate and mass-produce single, hyper-aggressive strains of baker's yeast. Industrial yeast prioritized speed and convenience. Bread went from a multi-day craft to a 3-hour manufacturing process, severing our daily connection to wild living ecosystems. When the fragile supply chain for that industrial yeast snapped in 2020, people sitting at home had to adapt. We reclaimed a biological relationship that had been outsourced to factories over a century ago. Today, that connection persists among devoted bakers who rigorously feed and monitor their jars. Some enthusiasts fiercely guard and share living starter lineages that have been passed down for generations. When you cultivate a sourdough starter, you act as caretaker for an ancient, microscopic civilization. You are participating in the exact same unbroken biological chain that has kept humanity alive from the Fertile Crescent to the present day.